impossible figures.
So
yeah.
it's
Because it's not really. I mean,
No, no,
it's what is it?
impossible equation.
Yeah, exactly. It's trompe-l'œil.
And we were going to keep that. When we will have new logos, of course, from the 1st of January, but they are quite.
When did that logo get?
It came out when we were
became a
formed,
university, yeah.
in 98. Actually.
Oh, in '98. Oh, okay.
Ja, absolut. Tack så mycket.
Wait 2 minutes.
And from you, it's only downwards. Do you have a program, Tapio, for the other?
Oh, the other speakers yet?
No.
Okay.
No, it's just about logistics. I think we have.
Oh, yes, water. Thank you. Thanks.
Okej.
That's great.
Göran Terbo. Såklart. Ja.
So I'll just put that one over
Yes,
there.
I'll probably need it.
Dr. B, take the Copenhagen people on Tuesday. No?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm losing track.
Yeah.
That's right. Because I'm staying alone Monday night, and then I'll.
You're staying Tuesday night in Copenhagen.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I might come back to you and ask you. The corona everything's very expensive here for us Californians.
It's even more expensive in Denmark.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Because I was looking at she suggested a hotel. It's I could probably do it. It's like $300.
Don't even try
400.
Norway. Don't even try.
Oh God, no, I don't remember that. But anyway, maybe I need to get a hotel. And I'll figure it out.
Jag börjar stå här. Så vi får med blommorna. Det är fint. Så. So, dear all, I'm Tapio Salonen. I'm a Pro Vice Chancellor here at Malmo University. It's a great pleasure to greet you all warmly welcome to this special event at our university. As you know, Malmo University is a young, open, urban, striving university. And next year we will become a full status university, and we are now taking new steps to address future societal challenges in our research and education. In order to mark the new status, the university will launch a number of activities over the next year. Among those, this series of seminars, Knowledge for Change. These seminars with internationally well-known scholars will highlight central challenges for our university. And we will, of course, announce coming seminars at our website. Today, we focus on university as an institution that not only meets the standards of excellence, focused on research, productivity, and rankings, but one that responds to the larger social needs and specific environment and people globally and locally. And to introduce today's keynote speaker, we have invited Mats Benner from Lund. He's a professor in science policy studies. So give Mats a warm hand.
Give me a small hand. Save the warm hand for John Douglas, who will speak after. There's nothing more tedious than a long preface, so I will keep this very short. But it's my pleasure to act as the midwife, so to speak, of connecting Malmö and Berkeley with a similar take, I would say, on what a university is. Cal. Even though it's the home of the of the Berkeley Laboratory and other. It's an institution in the service of society, and it has always been. It has created a number of interesting turmoils in the history, and if you want to delve deeper into that, you can check interesting studies by Clark Kerr and others on these developments. But there is an interesting connection, a hidden connection between Berkeley and Malmö that I think John Douglas will reveal. I first came across John's work when he did in his excellent work on the California model of education, which nicely summarizes a plan for how different universities, instead of mindless competition, what is the distance between Malmö and Lund, Tapio, etc., etc. All of these tedious jokes about competition in vain, and instead trying to find some institutional compatibility between different types of universities, inhabiting the same space, dealing with, engaging with similar issues in different ways. It's a pleasure to introduce a person who works at the very forefront, I would say, cutting edge of trying to escape from the straitjacket of rankings, metrics, and other doomsday machines that hang over universities in the world today. I mentioned before this that I spoke with a university president of Belgium who was in China, and he was asked not to say his name, but the ranking of his university when he was introduced. So we are at the very end, I think, of an era of the torture, mindless torture of rankings, which actually started out as some kind of consumer information, but we are now in a much more pressing situation for finding purposes and needs. John Douglas has encapsulated this in the concept of a flagship university, and we very much look forward to the outline of that. You will speak for about 40 minutes, then I will shut up and be organizing the microphone for about an hour or so, and then I assume that the chairperson will have the final say before we leave this venerable auditorium. But John, please step forward. The floor is yours.
See if I did this right. Sorry. This one. Oh, I think I have the wrong one.
You
This
sure?
was to be this one.
Yeah.
Sorry for the technical difficulties. This will shorten my speech by at least 5 minutes. So thank you so much, Mats, and it's a great pleasure to be here at Malmo University and to visit the city. I'm excited and learning much about Swedish higher education. I have some knowledge base, but I'm learning much more. And it's also very exciting to see the events that are happening here at your university and the ambitious yet seemingly doable strategies that you have. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So this book came out, and the original book that I'll be speaking about, the new Flagship University. And it was, as Matt said, very much an effort to try to create a framework to have an alternative language about what universities do, what's important to them, and how they function, their policies and procedures that make them much larger than simply research production factories. And then recently, just this week actually, came out another book. We had a conference at Zhejiang University around the themes of the book, and it was asked, well, how is this model relevant in Asia? And that led to this book that, as I just said, just came out of Berkeley Public Policy Press this week. But before I get into my talk, I do want to offer my apologies for the current situation in leadership in the United States. I'm often asked, how did this happen? And it's a bit of a loss to say it completely. and I won't get into this, but it is a major, obviously international event. And I won't talk about this now, but it also has some significant potential implications for how universities operate, the kind of difficulties they'll be facing, they are facing in light of the policies that are coming out of the Trump administration and the coming budget that's coming up, which will be really the #1 focus is on tax cuts and not on how to build a better, stronger nation. And at the same time, I do want to say my congratulations. It's a tremendous feat of what you've achieved in a very short period of time. And the environment and the things that you're now working in that seems very conducive to your ambition. So I'll come back to that theme. So, but here's what I want to talk about in this brief discussion. And the first is to say a little bit about ranking. Not too much, because I don't think that's really overall your concern. A little bit about the psychology. I think as Matt's just said, how important is it? How long will it last? I'm calling it a fad these days. I'll have a brief article in I don't know if you look at University World News, giving it that label, which does pose, let's just say, it's not necessarily a popular thing to say for certain groups of people who make a lot of money off of rankings or act as consultants or these kinds of things. There's a whole industry around ranking, which really is also related to the concept of world-class universities as they're married. A brief profile on the new flagship universities, and then a little bit about what that model might say, many of the things you're already doing, but some things to think about in a limited way before I conclude, and maybe we have some discussion about it. So first, the flagship university. For what purpose? Well, again, I've really narrowed this down. I'm not going to talk a lot about the framework within the book, but I think I identify in that book and in other publications something that's not unique, really. It's just my own attempt to kind of say, what are major universities? What's their purpose in the overall world that they live in? And as you can see, these are things that you're familiar with. One is contributing to a more equitable and prosperous society, advancement of individual human capabilities, productive learning and research environment, creation of new knowledge and preservation of the past, and then evaluation of society. There are different ways to do this. This is not unique. It's just a way of conceptualizing it. So when we talk about rankings, okay, which are dominant, not so much perhaps in Scandinavia, but in China or parts of continental Europe, ministries, government officials, whether it's in the UK, Nigeria, South America, South Africa, Brazil, they are all talking about how many universities need to be in this this ranking. Curious, I think Nigeria said that they were going to have at least 3 universities in the top 200 in the next 15 years or something like that. How that fits into the needs of Nigeria, I'm not sure, but it's very focused on that, on these measures of productivity. Oops, something's happening here. I don't know what's. There we go. I don't know what that was, but in any case, rankings generally, if you're not familiar with them, Matt's noted that they did begin really ranking. This kind of idea of ranking institutions really has a U.S. Origin, but the original rankings were very much focused on basically providing consumer guides. That they would look at various variables so students could take a look at them and decide what was the best place to go for a BA in humanities or these kinds of things. And that's still the large market in the US. The rankings that are really having a global influence on higher education came out of, originally the really first large-scale one was the Shanghai Jiaotong rankings that came out in 2003. And that was the result of government officials asking a group of researchers at Shanghai Jiaotong, could they help us kind of see the relative position of Chinese universities in terms of of their research productivity relative to Western universities and other parts of the world. And so these are very limited set of criteria generally. The Shanghai Jiao Tong is actually more credible than others, but it includes largely research productivity in terms of funding, citation analysis, whether you have Nobel laureates or field marshal, other kinds of markers of prestige, all focused very much on basically international standards of research productivity. There are a few others like the Times Higher Ed rankings that include reputational surveys, which I think are very questionable. Let's just say when I get a reputational survey and they ask me, what's the best university in the world? It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Also, reputation, while it is, one could have some credibility related to it, it's also a legacy often. There are lots of institutions that can have reputations that were built 40 years ago, and they maintain themselves even though perhaps the university isn't quite as good as it was, or so dominant in various fields as it once thought of. So I didn't want to get too much into the ranking aspect. It's a huge factor, perhaps not so much in Scandinavia, but in other parts of the world. It's dominating the behaviors of institutions. Let's just put it this way. Looking at your strategic plan, it doesn't look, the ones that I see in China and other places don't look anything like what you're talking about. And the issues of what they call in Europe a third mission, other kinds of activities that are engaged in local economic development, for example, or issues of equity are nowhere to be found. And so that's what I, just as a kind of a way of looking at that, that's where I say, here it is. These institutions, like a Berkeley, like a Malmo, have a much broader conceptual idea of what we're supposed to do, or a historical role. You are only here for 20 years, so you you have a long ways to go. But there are actually some interesting parallels with the University of California system, which I'll return to briefly. But these other activities are completely ignored in that overall global ranking frenzy. And then also the other thing I want to note too that is a real flaw, not only we could argue about the matrices that are used and their validity as a way of looking at how a university operates and serves society, is that it's also really built around the concept of a bell curve. So these institutions are fixated on, and ministries are often fixated on, this kind of structural approach to grading. One might argue that maybe bell curves make sense in a math class and giving out grades, but in terms of the wide variety of what institutions do, it seems like a very poor conceptual model. So, but I do want to say there are some positive things to the global ranking frenzy. One is they do offer, really for the first time, an understandable benchmark of performance in a certain very narrow area of performance. They've also really forced a lot of institutions that never really thought that much about what they were doing and what direction they were going in to go into a process of strategic planning. Now you've only been around for 20 years, and so you've probably had this already ingrained in you in certain ways, at least it appears to be the case. But many institutions have very little introspective thought about what they were doing until relatively recently. I think the German universities are a good example of that. They're still kind of caught in not all, but caught in a kind of a world of ivory tower conceptual model of what they're doing. And they're kind of irritated by the concept that they might be actually supposed to be economically engaged in their local communities. Of course, there's some very big differences. You've got the Max Planck Institutes and other kinds of structural things, because German research productivity is quite astounding, really. But they hadn't really been thinking very much about what they were really doing. And obviously, we could have some discussion about the validity of the excellence initiatives in Germany, which is just going through another round right now. Many universities are spending a lot of energy on it. But it did create a sense of, well, you have to understand where we're going and trying to think about how to plan it out and how to go after resources for that purpose. And another aspect that has been, I think, a positive one over the last 15 plus years is the beginning of an erosion of the civil service mentality of faculty. In many institutions, not many, almost all institutions throughout the world, there's been a very strong historical linkage of civil service for faculty, that it's not about your performance or the things that you do, but just how much time you've sat in a chair, a faculty chair or whatever. And so that there are negative things related to this, but generally I think it's been a very positive push. And as I said, also, often there are new resources that are provided. In the German case, they're providing monies to go after and do new innovative research projects, or sometimes just to strengthen the ones that they have at certain institutions, whether it's a Heidelberg or Bremen. But generally they have brought in new resources, and who can argue against new resources, right? Well, on the negative side, though, as I said before, the world-class university narrative dominates, really, maybe not here, but in many other parts of the world. And again, focus on the research publication quantity. And I think we've also got some problems. I was saying this in our meeting with Tapio and Mats in Carolina, that citation analysis are probably declining in their actual meaning. And the reason is there's just such a gigantic, well, I've got this kind of problem going on, and I don't know what it is. Failed. Oh, you are? Okay. Well, I'll keep touch. I'm gonna move it around then. I won't. I'll have to keep busy down here. I can't talk at the same time, but no. Okay. Well, we'll live with it then. What I was going to say. Oh, citation analysis is that there's just a gigantic proliferation of new journals and new articles coming out. It's an absolute explosion. Now that some of that reflects the growth of knowledge. Tremendous amounts of new information. We're going into new areas, whether it be in nanotechnology or informatics and other things of that nature. But it also reflects this underlying pressure to publish, which is not all bad, again. But what we're seeing is a huge proliferation. I was joking, I think as we sit here right now, there are probably 3 new journals that just got created in Asia. So there's the citation analysis is beginning to get into a kind of it's still, I'm not saying it's not valid, it has some ways of adjusting for quantity and size of publications, but we have this phenomena of people whose salaries are often dependent on their ability to get something published in an international journal, which also, as I'll come back to, is also degrading people who do interesting, important work that may be published more regionally that could have some impact on their local economies. That's the kind of bread and butter stuff that was part of Berkeley's founding and development over time, was a strong linkage of research that related not to some international journal, but to how we affect and can improve society or improve economic segments like agriculture or tech fields. So within this structure, you see a tremendous devaluating of regional research and teaching and learning and other kinds of aspects that I know that you value here at Malmo University. So how to define the flagship as an alternative narrative? Again, I'm just kind of going through a fast version of this. I did have some assumptions and things that I thought were important. And one of my pitches is that, in fact, many institutions, well, I just changed that. I just changed that one. You think it's on my screen, but it's okay. So one of my arguments is that, in fact, higher education leaders in various parts of the world, including the United States, have not been very good at articulating our overall meaning and purpose in life. And that this has political implications as well. And in fact, if we could talk about ministries and what they've tried to do in various parts of the world, and we could argue about whether they were productive or non-productive approaches by ministers who often don't have much experience at all in higher education or knowledge about what we do, perhaps. But they're the only ones who are conceptually thinking about what a nation like the UK really needs in its higher education system, because basically higher ed leaders in many parts of the world have just not bothered to think about the overall system or their particular role in it. In fact, most parts of the world, Universities see themselves not as a system or part of a national approach to higher ed, but really as an island into itself, in which to produce and produce research and prestige on its own. This is a great exaggeration. There are many variances, and this is changing very rapidly. But historically, this is very much the case. And as a result, what we've seen is that higher education priorities, national priorities, and how they fit into universities are often really up to the ministry and without significant voice from the higher education community itself or leadership. So some things about the flagship model is, again, I try to present it as an alternative narrative that seeks a more holistic and ecological vision of what constitutes the best and most influential national universities. And I will say, I really did focus on the concept of national leading universities because that's where the focus is on the world-class university model. But what I have in structurally has pieces that can fit with almost any university, and I think there are things that do fit well with Malmo University. And at the same time, in writing this out, I wasn't trying to create something that would say exactly what every institution should do, because there are huge cultural differences, structural differences in higher education systems, but really just to kind of set out something that can be at least seen as a common narrative, and that it is not necessarily that we are all doing everything excellent or there's one university that does it all, but that it's an aspirational model. Another assumption is that universities are evolving and changing, very much so. You know, part of the rhetoric is that universities haven't changed hardly at all, and that they, you know, the only thing older than the university structure in the world, I don't know if you've heard this one before, is the Catholic Church. Otherwise, if you go back and look at universities, they've existed in various forms and have survived revolutions, famines, economic collapse, fires, all kinds of things of that nature. But in fact, if you look at the profile of almost any university that is at least somewhat cognizant of the world, starkly different, not starkly, just very different in the range of things that they're doing, even in the last 30 years or so. And I could say that about Berkeley. If you look at their funding, the funding mechanisms and where the money is coming from and the variety of the things that we're doing today versus what we were doing 30 years ago, there are significant differences, tech transfer being one, and development of spin-offs of new businesses and these kinds of things, but also extension programs that are out to help various sectors of the economy or professional development. And you could just look at by following the money. Look at the money out range of things, and you can have a sense of that. So that's something that's important to understand, and they'll continue to evolve, one assumes, partly because they're such vital components of almost any society, any postmodern knowledge-based economy. So the other part, though, that is very important is that while a lot of institutions keep waiting for the next ministerial edict to tell them what to do, which is just the case in many parts of the world, although, again, it's just changing, it really is the best institutions are the ones that have an internal academic culture that is really focused on, one, a broad understanding of their mission and internal accountability structures to make sure that they're doing the right things or doing new initiatives. And that's also something, at least I'm saying this without a lot of knowledge, but having a sense of what Malmo University and looking at your documents, it does appear that you've got some of the aspects of this currently. I'm sure there are a lot of structural and other issues that relate to that that need to be discussed. But it seems like you have the beginnings, or you have an internal institutional culture that is important for really producing high quality teaching, research, and public service. So I do say about the Flagship that they're research intensive but equally committed to teaching, learning, and public service. That they are generally comprehensive institutions seeking strength across the disciplines, and that they're internationally engaged but focused first on regional national economic development and public service across the disciplines as well. As opposed to, there are many institutions, for example, particularly in Asia, that are really very heavily focused on international engagement because international engagement is valued by the ministry and otherwise, and they're proliferating with all kinds of MOUs and joint degree programs that aren't really well thought out at all, but just seem to be part of the markers of what they're supposed to do in their national government's eyes. Other things I say about the flagship, and then I'll move on, is that they need to be broadly accessible, selective, but representative of the population they serve. That's not an easy thing to do, but there are pathways for that. Sufficiently autonomous and publicly financed, easy to say. Again, going back to internal academic culture, that they do have pieces that are evidence-based, which they're using evidence-based management and a focus on institutional self-improvement. That means you have to have certain structural approaches to management capacity. Also, as I say in this is an important component, is how important institutional research is. The ability to have good data about what your institution does, not so you can tell the ministry about it, although that's usually the driver for many institutions, but so you can make your own decisions internally as to how to strengthen or see weaknesses in your programs and how to strengthen them. So that's a really important aspect. And then again, as I said before, it is a struggle at times because there's such variation among national systems that to find a common narrative, one has to be careful, and I try to, and I note in the book various weaknesses in the argument as well. So now the ecology of the Flagship University, I'm not going to get too much into this because I want to talk about Malmo University and some of the things in the model that might be of interest to you. But this is the general structure that I have in the book, in which I talk about what's the position of that institution in the national system. Does it have a defined service area, for example, or does it see itself as a national approach to access, for example? And then if you look at it's hard for me to see these things, core mission of teaching, learning, and research. I go through these various categories and talk about them, and innovation. And part of the book is also to show examples of innovative programs that relate to these areas by institutions throughout the world. There are a lot on the U.S., but there's also ones about Campinas, University of Campinas in Brazil, or ETH Zurich, these kinds of things. So we talk about these kinds of structurally. What are the markers of these institutions and what are their policies and practices that are exemplary, I think. There's also the concept of broader economic engagement, engaged scholarship service, regional economic engagement, tech transfer, lifelong learning, relations with schools also. And these are some of the areas I'm going to come back to. And then there's this listing and talking about institutional management, accountability, and management of capacity. And so this is the structure. I'm not going to talk all about these things. I can return to some of them if you would like. But I've already said some of the conundrums that one looks at. One that was noted a lot when I did this exercise was the lack of resources to really fulfill some of the missions of the broader mission. I had an example, for example, looking at Chile. They noted two major problems with trying to match this model, which they did appreciate and liked, was money, but also the civil service mentality of faculty and how intransigent they were. And it doesn't lend itself, this model also doesn't lend itself to matrix in any meaningful way because it has a lot to do with a qualitative approach. So now some comments and thoughts about Malmo in relationship to the theme of your series, Knowledge for Change. So I return again to this kind of structural approach, my particular approach as to what our institutions are supposed to be doing. And I'm really focusing more on the, one question would be, well, where is Malmo University in this structural approach to the purpose of a major university? What things are more important than compared to others? And so the one thing that I think I'm focusing on in terms of what in the flagship model as well is this idea of engaged scholarship and public service. This seems to be at the core of so much of your strategic plan. And within the areas that I do talk about within the book that relate to that, these are some or most of the major ones I've identified. Relations with schools, outreach, and mission standards. This is basically about, well, what is the overall relationship of Malmo with local schools? What kind of I know you have a school of education, and perhaps I'm sure there are programs that you have, but what is that kind of linkage with those institutions? And also, how do they link into providing outreach for underrepresented groups? You have a larger immigrant population than I really realized in terms of first-generation students in Sweden overall. So one would assume that the local relationship with schools would be important. It could be more regional in its approach. It could approach Lund, I suppose. I don't know. You don't have a school of ed, so... So yes, I know the history of that a little bit now. Faculty in the areas of teaching, engaged scholarship, and public service. Students, this concept of engaged learning, which I'll come back, and service learning, and community volunteering. Regional economic engagement, curriculum and regional labor needs, in other words, the matching of curriculum and regional labor needs. Faculty expertise, tech transfer and startups, which I assume is also a component of a growing component of what you're hoping to do. Lifelong learning, we call that extension in the United States. You know, the University of California has right now around 240,000 students in its regular program, but we have over 400,000 people in extension programs in a given year. Gives you the understanding of the size and scale of that. And extension in UC, in the University of California, goes back to the 1890s. So you can see how important that is as a link to regional economic development. And then regional coordinations of higher education institutions, concepts of regional service areas. I presume, do you have a conceptual idea of a service area in which you're doing specific things? Well, I'll come back to that, but you may. But many institutions don't. So now I'll just talk for a little bit about little parts of that, of those areas that relate to the themes of this talk series. So first degree students, or what we would call undergraduates in the United States. One is this concept of engaged learning, which is really growing and becoming a significant player in curriculum reform in the United States and in various other parts of the world, and I presume here to some degree. This kind of movement away, I know we're a long distance from that, but historically, the movement away from rote learning, which still exists in many parts of the world. And in fact, you'll find much of that still in existence in parts of Asia, even though they're trying to change that. It relates to culture, a lot of different things, but really moving towards this concept of engagement in various forms. And a lot of research shows us that students that are engaged there are a lot of benefits, not only to their own learning once they're in the university, but also in the kinds of skills that they have for when they get into the labor market. But engaged learning can be a lot of different kinds of things, and it's not just in the classroom, and that's important to understand. I'll come back to that a little bit. And that some institutions just say, well, we'll let students go volunteer or do other kinds of work that could be engaged, and they'll just do it on their own. But most universities in the United States, for example, have significant programs to help support students to be engaged in not only in the classroom, but in what we call extracurricular activities, that is starting clubs, student newspaper. Again, student government is a little different here. There are different dynamics in student government in Europe than in the United States. But their undergraduate research experience, there are various varieties of things that look at. Here's a conceptual model, or at least what I see I've got a little problem there, but of what engaged learning is about. It's easy to say these things, but it does set up a matrix in which many institutions in the United States, at least, are heavily involved in thinking of how to reform or add to the curriculum. Inquiry-based learning, experiential learning, that is public service of various sorts, research engagement. That is a growing area, and I presume it is here, of very significant change in the undergraduate experience in major universities and colleges in the United States. Major efforts to increase the amount of research engagement students have, and that can range from working in a lab to going on their own independent research base or with a team. I have a project right now in which I've got like 11 undergraduate students working on a big data project with a colleague, and they're all econ students, and they're all basically doing it because it's part of a requirement now in their econ program. So integrative knowledge, obviously interdisciplinary opportunities, collaborative learning and problem solving, learning about diversity and global citizenry, ethics and responsibilities. Here's another area of growth, partly because of problems with related to the internet and cheating and these kinds of things, but also about professional ethics, quantitative literacy, communication skills, and digital literacy. So this is kind of a shopping list, but it's a kind of it's one way of conceptualizing the concept of engaged learning. So I wanted to give you an example of 2 service learning programs. We call this service learning. Do you use that terminology here? Okay, so this is a growth area in the first degree curriculum, and that is, again, these structural approaches to getting students out to be working in local communities, whether it's in hospitals or schools or city planning offices, all kinds of different things. And it really makes a difference if there is a structural approach to it. And then there's a debate about credit. For example, at Berkeley, we don't provide credit for students who go out and do even if it's a structured program by the university itself. But at Minnesota, which is very innovative in this area, they do have a credit, as you can see. Each semester, Minnesota offers 50 courses, most for credit. They've got about 2,000 students in it. They have their own community service learning center, for example, that helps facilitate these kinds of relationships. And they are, again, the important part of these kinds of programs is that they're not just some side thing that's being done by, a student service administrative side. They're linked to the academic program. They have to have oversight and engagement by faculty in various forms. Texas A&M is another one. There are many different versions of this story, and perhaps it is here too as well. But it's a growth area, and both are about teaching and learning, but also how to link with local communities and support them, and also have a presence. The university has a presence in the community, which adds to their perceived value, obviously. Another area, though, I want to talk about, and this relates to some research that we're doing in a project that Mats knows about, and I'm happy to say Lund University is joining in this data collection on survey research. But one important thing that we really understand is that there are many different student experiences and learning processes, and we have to recognize that and think about that as we develop first degree programs that link with the concept that we're not only providing a fulfilling experience for students, but that they also have a contribution to give out to the community while they're students, and that can also fit into their future role as part of the labor force. This conceptual model of multi-engagement, students are doing many things. They're not just going to class, right? They live in various places, they socialize. And so one needs to look at the socioeconomic background of students, the mental health, social, oops, I don't know why it does that. Their mental health, social support systems, and sense of belonging at a large university. different intelligences and abilities and interests that may change over time. We know this for sure. I mean, you can observe it, obviously, but we have lots of data to show major differences in students' learning and capabilities as they go. I mean, through their academic career. Of course, we would assume that's the case, right? But do we have data to prove it? In the United States, there's been a book that came out about 6 years ago that was based on a very, let's put it, not a very good quantitative survey. Not a survey, I'm sorry, a test of student learning. And it claimed, looking at a broad range of American universities, that students didn't learn anything, virtually zero, in a 2-year period at various institutions. And this got huge press. Wall Street Journal, students are spending all, and their families are spending all this money and they don't learn anything, or hardly anything. Now, come on. If somebody learns something, almost anybody who's at least, almost anybody learns something over 2 years. So we're looking at other kinds of data and others are looking at it. But this was a major area of discussion, very counterintuitive, but one does need to think about developing data to actually counter such discussions and arguments. And then, of course, the field and disciplines that students are in are very important aspects. So this is just to give you a sense of, well, what does that mean? Well, here's a popular sense of the U.S. and AU. These are Association of American Universities that are the top 60 or so universities. They're self-described top. It's a club, really. But Berkeley's a founding member. About half are the private institutions, and most, the other half are public ones like Michigan and Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and Texas, and North Carolina, and Virginia, and it goes on. But I think what you could say is this conceptual idea is that this is really the way students spend their time. Curricular engagement is where it's all out. They might do a little bit of research engagement. This might be larger than really is the popular understanding. Extracurricular activities, then again, these are things like clubs, everything from the undergraduate economy major club or engineering to the Beyonce club. We see lots of data that shows that students who are engaged in these kinds of activities are actually learning very important skills, budgeting, communications, these kinds of things. And then public and community service as well. I'm sorry, I should have here social life, the other kinds of things that students are involved with as well, but I didn't put it in this one. So, but maybe this is closer to the reality, the average undergraduate, from what we can tell. This is the average, okay? This is not based on data. This is just my conceptual way of talking about it, okay? So, but what we do know from the data is that these are not mutually exclusive activities, that students are often engaged in a lot of different forms that overlap and interlink with their overall activities. So, for example, a student that's heavily, at least again, according to the data that we're looking at these kinds of institutions, a student that's highly engaged in student government, or let's put it a better one would be the Beyonce fan club, doesn't mean that they spend all their time doing that. They are also, they could be also curricularly engaged in doing research, that they don't exclude each other. I mean, this was an important aspect. We were trying to look at this. If a student is doing X, does it exclude other kinds of activity and learning? But what we're finding is tremendous overlap, and that most students are engaged, highly engaged, at least one or two of these areas, and that they aren't mutually exclusive. So, but one has to also look at discipline and many other variables. So perhaps this is closer to the average for a third-year engineering major at an institution like Berkeley. Research engagement grows tremendously in their overall experience and the opportunities. And then I guess I would ask, in looking at this kind of a modeling, is, well, what's the pattern at Malmo University? Are there ways to conceptually look at it that way? Okay, so finally I need to wrap up here, is that faculty, research, and teaching staff are, I shouldn't say finally, but this aspect of, I wanted to talk about this briefly, about faculty. And I know that there are significant differences in the structure of faculty staffing in Sweden than, say, at a place like Berkeley or other American universities. But I'm focusing more or less on faculty who have both teaching and research responsibilities. So looking at that segment, and obviously in terms of your overall plans, this is a significant area of growth. You're entering in a period in which you will be more competitive, or you need to be more competitive for research funding, meaning that you have to be more productive in that area. So one thing that's very important that does not exist in many institutions is a clear statement to faculty, I'm going to talk about these kind of faculty, about what their responsibilities are in the institution. How do they translate not just to teaching? Often many institutions just say, oh, here's your teaching load, and by the way, you're a faculty member here, and you need to publish a lot, and that's about all they say. But they don't relate it to the overall purpose of the institution themselves or some larger matrix of understanding. So when a person comes in, they say, this is what I'm going to be judged on. What am I doing in the larger aspect of serving the university's mission, for example? So this is just a way of looking at, in the book, I go through a bit of this conceptual idea of what faculty are doing and what, again, this kind of modeling about how much time they're spending on these various activities. But it's important that they have some statement that is broad about what their responsibilities are, besides just teaching a class and producing research, but broader areas of public service, mentorship of students and faculty and staff, research not as defined as only as producing citations, but that are also relevant to local communities. I know I will say that at Berkeley, this is highly valued in the process of academic advancement, hiring and advancement. What are you doing that helps produce and extends the university's role in local communities or in the state or other kinds of things? And that's stated, and I know that it motivates me. I know I'm going to be evaluated in that form. So again, I already said this, but faculty need a clear outline of expectations to help them shape their behaviors. And it's also, though, important in the process is to understand that faculty change over time in their interests and their capabilities, and that there's some kind of relationship to that kind of outline of what you're being evaluated that understands that there's variation in what faculty do by age, but also by discipline. And so one other area that I discuss in the book some is this conceptual model of, well, there's a very traditional concept of research output that is also, I think, highly linked to the rankings and structural approach to this basically research productivity. But there are other kinds of scholarship that are now being recognized more and more as an alternative kind of conceptual model as to what it is. So this is called the scholarship of public engagement, and that this should be a part of, and I think it is. I get it from at least looking again at the materials I have from Malmo University, that there are aspects of this. But so you can, I won't go through these all, but you can see this kind of conceptual difference between what is a more traditional view of scholarship and really what is another framework. It isn't to say that basic research or things that are that lead to citation analysis aren't important. It's just that this needs to be a broader understanding of what faculty are doing in their research activities, and again, linking it back to the process of both hiring and advancement. Okay, so final thoughts on what limited knowledge I have about Malmo University by my attempt to look at the strategic documents and to learn more broadly about what the OECD says about Sweden and these kinds of things. So, one, I think it's obviously an extremely exciting time for Malmo University. There just seems to be an alignment of things that make this institution have a vital and interesting future. One, obviously, location, 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 as they say. That's the one thing, even though there's this rhetoric around globalization and that geography doesn't matter. That's not really the case when it comes down to universities. They act as anchor institutions that other things revolve around, and they're still strongly geographically based. And so you've got a vibrant regional city area with educational, labor, and research needs, and apparently local government and other support. They understand that the university is a valued piece, intellectually, perhaps culturally, but also economically. You can, more people hired here. This is a good green footprint kind of approach to labor development. You're not producing smokestacks and various chemical discharges from factories. So this is the modern era of knowledge-based economies. A starting point, too, that seems to value socioeconomic engagement. I think it's so obviously it's very pervasive in the documents that you have. So all the pieces of values that I was worried about in various other parts of the world seem highly valued here, which is good. A national environment that is less concerned with ranking and the world-class university rhetoric. I hope I'm correct in that. Okay, I may be corrected about that. I realize that there is a structural approach that's coming from the Swedish Higher Education Authority, in which some of your budget is being related to citation analysis and other words, but it still seems like a relatively small, it may grow, I understand that, but a relatively small part of what you have to deal with thus far. Seemingly a relatively high institutional autonomy. I realize there are structural things that are probably mandated related to faculty and positions and these kinds of things, but my sense is that you have a lot of opportunities internally to make decisions about which direction you want the university to go. Of course, you have to be competitive for funding and other sources. You got to pay for it. So at the same time, though, getting back because I saw your head nodding, Tavio, is that it also a shift in which you will have more performance-based funding, perhaps, or that's going to be an evaluation of some sort. That means higher expectations. You have an ambitious plan that you've forwarded to now launch you into the status of accredited university. So that means in 5 or 6 years, one presumes, or less, that you're going to have to show some aspects of performance related to that. Also, I think that challenge within that is that matching an ability to have high-quality third cycle degree programs. It seems like you have the pieces of it, but it's also a challenge to do that, to have the right faculty and to build these kind of programs that have quality and are known to have quality to attract good quality students. So at the same time, though, understanding that, I do think that it appears to be a reasonable strategic plan in the short term. It seems like a good academic planning document on the short term. Again, I already said this performance will be key. But I also don't quite understand where your long-term plan is. And perhaps you don't want to say that, or maybe you have differing views because it does ask the question sometimes that, planning documents, strategic planning documents are often more about process than the actual document that comes out. At least if you try to have a cycle of a new document every 5 or 4 years or something like that, it's about talking to each other, developing consensus about what direction the institution should be going to, and obviously the leadership to help manage that. And this transition from a Hug School to a university, which is a regional urban university, it sounds like a comfortable space to be in. But it is ask that question, where are we going in the long term? Let's say 20 or 15 years down the road. Is it a research-intensive university? Is it, which I don't think Lund would enjoy having next door? We don't know, because you're all competing for resources. So that's just an open question, and I can understand why you wouldn't want to answer that completely at this stage in your historical development. So I just asked that question, how to get from here to there. It seems on the short term you have a very strong understanding and you're competitive for income to do it. And then I'll just finally say that I don't think it matches completely, but the University of California has gone through a series of establishing new campuses and has a lot of experience in doing that. And obviously they have very high quality institutions, but the framework is different as well. But you might find some interesting parallels to look at, and maybe, and I know you're looking at other case examples of other institutions. The one thing is, again, strategic plans tend to be much more meaningful for young institutions than old institutions. When you're at a place like Berkeley, which has been around since 1868 and has a mature and lots of constituents and faculty with their own ideas and their own fiefdoms, doing new things is very difficult, and doing a planning process is usually not very meaningful except for very targeted areas to try to get some money from the state or from the national government or something like that. But here you're young and new, and so you have lots of opportunities to think broadly. So with that, I'll only say finally is that I hope what I presented gave you a conceptual idea of why I don't like rankings and why maths doesn't like it either, and trying to label world-class universities as fads. I think it is kind of a fad. There's a whole history actually of fads in higher education in the United States, and there's been some books written about it. It's very interesting. And then at the same time, I hope the framework maybe is some conceptual model you could think about as to what are the areas that Malmo University wants to really continue or is doing well or could do better or wants to do more on. So with that, thank you very much.
I do like this. My head is poorly constructed for this. Thank you very much, John, for this enlightening presentation. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I think the pudding is in the audience now. So maybe someone wants to challenge John in the reading of the... I have other questions, John, so don't worry. Carolina warned me that the pudding might be quiet, but I don't think it is, because you said some really sort of penetrating but also reflective things on Malmö. So we have one over there, please. Present yourself.
I think, yeah.
Hello, my name is Magnus Johansson. I work here at the university. I actually worked here since the beginning, 1998. Thank you for a very interesting speech. I think a little bit, because if you want to develop this flagship university, you also need to have research funding for flagship research projects. And some of the problems that you described are a consequence of how research fundings are acting and what kind of projects get funding. So I wonder, when you present these thoughts for policymakers or representatives from national research fundings or politicians or even people from the business who also should pay, what kind of responses do you get from this? Or is it, because I think one of the obstacles and one of the hindrances for develop this flagship university is that it's, at least today, rather tricky to get money for doing this kind of flagship research projects.
Well, let's see. I think, I have to admit, most of the people I talk to in my audience are universities themselves, and trying to convince them that they should stop waiting for the next government edict and try to figure out what they should be doing internally. I think in many ways, partly because you're so young, partly because you're in Sweden, a variety that values higher education, different environment, you're able to think strategically about these kinds of things and perhaps pursue that. You are pursuing it, aspects of the flagship model, and I don't want that flagship model to be overly, dominant in the conversation. It's more like pieces of it, what fits into Malmo. So I don't talk to ministries that much. about it. But you do point to the question of what is the overall funding environment for higher education in different parts of the world. How does it fit into what you're doing here in Sweden? And what I can tell from, at least I think I understand from looking at the documents and looking at some of the government policies that have come out recently, is there's an expectation, yes, now you're a university, but you need to be more productive in research. They don't define it. I mean, maybe they do define it. If it is citation analysis, this is the way we're going to evaluate you. I would hope it'd be broader than that, because you know there are other ways of doing research that relate to, like I said, local economic development. So the pressure is on you. I can't comment completely universally as to what ministries should be doing in research funding, but this question is what is the overall environment here at Malmo to, one, be more competitive and be more productive in various forms of research. And I'm sorry, I'm going to segue slightly to the questions because, you know, a big aspect of this relates to faculty or teaching staff. Again, you use different language in different parts of the world, but I'm talking about the overall academic staff and what's the composition of that staff, and what's a reasonable expectation for them in terms of research productivity versus other responsibilities. And so I asked a little bit about this when we were at our pre-meeting, is that structure of the faculty, will that have to change in order to be more competitive for research money or to be more productive in research? How does it fit into the overall, you know, Swedish structure of research funding, which now includes, I should note that, which now includes not only the Swedish government, but the EU research funding as well. And I know there's an expectation that you will bring in more money. So you've now raised the stakes, and now you have to, and you have all pieces, and you have aspirations. Then the question is structurally, how do you do that? So.
Good. Please.
So my name is Pontus, and I'm the current student, the president of the student union Malmö here. And one thing that we discuss a lot here is like engaged learning and also engaged students and what that is, because we can see that we have problems with this here. Like both teacher and other students, they complain that other students, they don't come to lectures, they don't come to workshops. But also we have a lack of student representatives and like groups in the university, decisions groups, etc. And also when it comes to social activity in the union. So that's a big question, and the question I have is like, how should we see on engaged students and what that is? Because I think it's a big question to ask.
Yeah, so I think I saw a couple of different things you're asking. One was related to the concept of engagement, and for example, one basic marker of engagement is, do they go to class? Do they do their homework? You know, do they do things outside of the classroom that relate to the classroom work, teaching, or other kinds of things? So that's a great area. What I will say is there are many cultures in different parts of the world in which students don't show up at class and are very unengaged. A great example is Japan. There are others in that they have a culture in which students work very hard to get into the top universities, the imperial university structures, the Tokyos, but the Kyotos, the Osakas, and the others. And once they do that, they just figure, oh, well, now I'm in the club. I don't need to show up at class. And the faculty have very low expectations as well. And so you have this whole cycle of low expectations. And it's a huge problem. They recognize it now. It's a huge problem in Japan. So that's an extreme example, but perhaps you're telling me that students don't show up at class that much here. Isn't that what you were saying? No. Some do, some don't. They can also look online and watch the classes, so there's other kinds of activities that are going on. Okay, so that's one area. And I don't know enough about what's happening here, but I would sense that this conceptual idea of engagement is powerful. It's being thought of in various forms, and I presume it's being pursued in various here at Malmo and so on. Then you were asking about student unions and membership and student activities and that. And I don't know enough about, I know the long history, particularly in Europe and Northern Europe, of student unions and their roles in government in governance and these kinds of things. But I don't have enough knowledge really to say, well, students should be more engaged in government or not. I think at least in places like the Netherlands, I know that student unions are more like political activities than they are about really, assisting in the process of improving the university's activities. That's my kind of thinking about it. They're more linked to political parties than they are. Is that the case here? A little bit of both, okay.
You used to be.
Depends on where you are in the world. But
Used to be.
yeah.
Please.
So, on one of you, hi, I'm Pille Brolman Wengerfeldt. I'm a professor of media and communications here in Malmö. And one of the slides said that internal academic culture is most important.
Yes.
And you kind of slipped over it. So I'm just wondering, can you expand that little idea a little bit? What consists an internal academic culture, a great internal academic culture?
Yeah, well, in the broad sense, is shared governance. What is the role of faculty and administrators in helping to manage the institution itself? And so I could talk about some of those aspects. There's a lot of discussion about what is the relative role of faculty, and then also what is the relative strength of the leadership of the institution to help drive a strategy or change. And so in much, my assessment is that in much of Europe, there has been very weak, a structural weakness, not the people, structural weakness in the management capacity of institutions. They have tended to, historically, been related to not really a system of shared governance in which you're jointly working together to try to figure out how to improve your look for problems in your programs or whatever, or strengthen areas. They've been basically a system of electing a person who will not to be the vice rector or whatever the title is, warden in the UK or whatever, who will not make waves, who will not really be able to have much strength and leadership to change things at all. So I'm not trying to advocate a strong CEO. It's just that there's a strong tradition in the European university model of very weak management capacity. And this is why you're seeing also, though, this is all changing, and there's a lot, this is why you're seeing, this concept of autonomy and chartering has been going on in various parts of the world. And in France, for example, not always the greatest example on higher ed, but is that there's been this movement towards trying to create greater management capacity by giving them more autonomy. And more autonomy means like, you can move your finances around in ways that you couldn't do before. It had to have national government approval. So one is, what is the role of faculty and administrators in management? How much authority does the actual academic leadership of the institution have to help drive strategy and change? Those are these kind of broad things, and I do talk about them in the book, and it's a very relevant and there's a controversy about these kinds of things, whether there's a kind of a pyramid or it's flat, or in China it's like this. There's authority and everybody does everything, and sure, you can build a building like that, but there's not a lot of collaborative structural approach to what they're doing at these universities. Then what I would say is there are certain patterns and mechanisms that are about internal accountability, and they're very simple. They relate to how our faculty are evaluated in the broad, as I said before, in the broad range of things they do, not just research productivity, but also the quality of their teaching, public service, and these other kinds of things. So how faculty are evaluated. Then there's program review. So this is this conceptual idea. We call it program review. You may call it something else. Every 8 years, it depends on the place, has some kind of structural approach to reviewing their academic programs. Now, what I'm arguing is that institutions need to do this internally. This isn't part of the Swedish higher ed authority. They may have their own, and this is difficult because there can be different demands that you face when you have a ministry that is very let's say, wants to have its fingers in everything that you do and all of that kind of thing. Institutions need to have their own internal process of program review that's confidential, that's about them looking at their weaknesses and strengths. It's not about PRing for the ministry, that they can take a look at those kinds of activities. I will say, from the viewpoint of a place like Berkeley, we've had program review since about the 1958 or so. It's been absolutely huge component as to overall our ability to improve ourselves and find our weaknesses and those kinds of things. So those are kind of just general programmatic structural approaches. Now, some institutions, I'll just say, is that, and it's easy for me to say this, but many institutions are just overwhelmed by the number of demands that come from their ministries about accountability, about their programs were reviewed. So, it's hard for me to unpack that and what the experience is in Scandinavia. But really, you've got to be thinking about your own internal processes for accountability. I'm sorry, the other one I wanted to mention too is, as I said before, the importance of institutional research. It's hard to be a good manager of an institution unless you have a good systematic approach to data collection, analysis, things that can help you make decisions and also inform you about what really is going on in your institutions.
Just let the microphone pass one person, so please.
I'm Tom Popkowitz from the University of Wisconsin.
Oh.
And I live in a flagship university. And so I had some questions because, to be honest, I didn't recognize a flagship university from what you were talking about, so I need you to respond. My understanding of my university, but also Berkeley a little bit, because I work with some people actually in your institute, is that one of the things that made them great universities, I'll talk about it that way, was the lack of strong management. Most of your discussion was about the relationship of the psychological qualities of students and organizational qualities. And yet, historically, when I think about the universities, it's what David Labrie, he just wrote, I don't know if you've read
I know
David's
David,
book,
yeah.
The Perfect Mess.
Yeah.
Okay. In that it's decentralized, there isn't strong management. One of the issues today in the US is just bringing in strong management, which loses or could lose all the things that have made them flagships, including, I think your comment was right on target. One of the things about Wisconsin that saves it so far is this very strong academic culture. So when people come in with strong management, the academic culture is a way of deflecting it. The chancellor, former chancellor, David Ward, who is a human geographer, said, we have to rationalize. But how do we rationalize in a way that maintains an academic culture? And I don't know if you want to respond to that. That is how this model you have respond to an academic culture versus a management culture.
Yeah, well, one thing is, in my usage of the terminology of flagship, I'm not necessarily referring to an historical understanding of the American flagship university. I mean, I am, but I'm expanding on it, saying we're doing all these other kinds of things. That's why I call it the new flagship. So I'm a little bit broader in my conceptual idea. So your question about managerial authority versus kind of, bottom-up kind of approach. So older institutions have patterns of behavior that are different than the younger and institutions that are developing over time. So the comments I'm making relate to looking at the activities not in the United States but throughout the world in which there's tremendous development of these institutions and how are they redefining their relationships. And basically the historical pattern is a very flat line in which a civil service mentality, which is also a different kind of conceptual beginning, in which hardly anything can be done. I mean, I know you think that maybe nothing can be done at Berkeley, Wisconsin. I understand that. But relatively speaking, have been, although Wisconsin has had we've had financial problems. There's a whole politics to what's been going on in Wisconsin that is different than in other parts of the U.S. pretty much. But so I'm taking a viewpoint of looking at what is happening in the patterns of changing management in institutions throughout various parts of the world. And that's why I said the French version is very good, because basically it's moved from a civil service of the universities, right? Not the écoles. The universities are moving from a process of flatline, nobody can do anything, and the authority of the institution doesn't even have fiduciary ability to, in other words, to spend money in various forms, to some kind of new relationship. And so the structural way I've approached this is to say there has to be a balance between bottom up and the ability at the institutional level to have leadership. Now we could get into a whole theory about, well, how do managers, the best managers, I don't know if you thought David Ward was a good manager or not. So David was at our center for a period. I know him quite well. And he is the former chancellor at Wisconsin. And the secret in these, again, the institutional age, breadth of programs, prestige, there are all kinds of factors that relate to management capacity. But if you're in a mature institution in particular, the way that you really manage is never to say that it's your idea that we're going to do this new program. You're always looking down to bring up the ideas and then to nurture them. And so, for example, I do know you were talking about having a new program with an RFP. You have an RFP, request for proposal, and you bring it out, and you say, here's the conceptual things we want to do. Now let's hear what the faculty or the people who know what they're talking about, how they do it. So that's a process in which you are looking at a management structure that balances some ability to do strategic planning at the leadership level, the academic leadership level, not administrators, versus the faculty. So I'm sorry, a little long because it was a very good question and a tough one, is that what we're seeing in most parts of the world is a movement from a very flat line in which there was no strategic and management capacity to some kind of a hybrid, and they're struggling to figure out how to do that. In France, I know it's a huge issue. What's the role of the faculty in management? They don't have a conceptual model about it because it was all structured around civil service, equity, everybody gets a piece of everything, versus looking at other more strategic approaches to allocation of resources for research and these kinds of things. So I hope I kind of answered your difficult question.
To be continued, perhaps. Are there other questions? I can sort of chip in while we wait for another one. Can everything be a flagship? I mean, what's the delimitations of a flagship? I mean, flagship indicates somehow that it sort of stands out.
Yes. Now this is, okay, so I faced a conundrum in writing this book. Was I going to talk about what every institution should be doing, or am I going to talk about what leadership, national leadership universities are doing? And part of the reason I focused it on that conceptual idea was because of the power of ranking and world-class university rhetoric. So I really, in the language in the book, I'm talking about leading national universities. Now, so is Malmo a leading national university? Well, perhaps not at the moment, right? It's a more regional. But the model itself has pieces that are not exclusively for what I would say a Berkeley or a Tsinghua or a Heidelberg. I know that's not a good example. But those German universities are very conservative. And so so that's what I presented here was there are pieces of this model that make sense to any general university. So I fall a bit into a trap because I was trying to say, where I thought I could have the most impact was to speak to these institutions that see themselves as national universities or feel pressure by the ranking game and are behaving in very bad ways. Many institutes, not all, but many, we were talking again about Chinese universities. You have to understand how cruel to some degree, but also misdirected much of the pressure is on faculty to produce research. It's having, one, I don't know if you're aware, not that there aren't a lot of great things going on in Chinese higher education, and that there is definite evidence of growth and productivity in the sciences, humanities and social sciences, not so much. It's a kind of there are the cultural reasons for this, I think. But the pressure to produce on faculty is so intense, and their plagiarism is a problem. Their salaries are linked to it. For example, in most of the top national universities, your salary is linked to whether you get something published in an international journal. And then also, there are extreme cases in which an apartment is allocated if you produce X amount. So there are the behavioral patterns which are, again, saying to other institutions, to faculty, local economic engagement isn't that important. And again, I'm not saying this is everywhere. There are definite examples of other institutions that are doing very significant local economic engagement. Zhejiang University, for example, I know is very productive. It's also in the tech hub of China. So I kind of conceptually went at this concept of a national university, but there are pieces and elements that are extremely relevant to Malmo. And in fact, you're doing many of these things. You're obviously thinking in a framework that I think is extremely productive. Yeah.
Please.
Thank you. I'm Per Hilbo, and thanks, Tom, for reminding me that I'm a human geographer and part of the management. But anyway, we are a young university, and maybe we will fit into the top 10 universities of under 20 years or something like that. There are rankings for those as well. Before we go to the next category, I was thinking, which means that we don't talk a lot about excellence at the moment at our university, but there is one area where we sometimes take pride in saying that we have excellence, and that comes to widening participation. Widening participation or widening access to the university, if that is an excellence area. And of course, it's all about the diversity of the student population, which we try to see as an important quality to our university. With your experience and so on, I would like to hear a little bit, to reflect on that, what you have seen from other areas when it comes to, how to raise this issue of the diversity of the student population, as an important quality for our university.
Well, again, the U.S. example or the California example does, this is a huge area, and it has been for 40, 50 years. The first actual programs to really deal with this came out of the civil rights era in 1960s in the U.S., so it's been part of the culture of institutions for a very long time. So what I would say is, again, not knowing enough about your own world and environment, is that outreach is a really, really important component of looking to widening participation. And what I mean by that is, again, as I was saying, relations with schools or relations with local communities, that, in some form, if you were to say, for example, I would hope that you might say, we have a regional service area. It doesn't mean we don't do other things outside that regional service area, but we're focused on having, say, a wide representative body of students from the region, and so we have strategies to do that. Well, one of them is, particularly for disadvantaged students, perhaps your immigrant population. Again, I don't know what the demographic mix of your students are. You need to have an actual presence in those places. You have to help local schools. You can do very simple things, for example. One is you have letters of invitation to come visit the campus or these kinds of things. Maybe you do that. So you're already doing those kinds of things. So outreach is a really important component. Also the relationship with schools, how curriculum is structured locally. Is there some, institutional university-based relationship with local schools, and presume, is that the case as well? You do have in curriculum development. Okay, so you're doing some of that. Then there's the process of actual selection. Because the outreach, the concept is you're growing your pool of students who would like to come to your institution, or students who are from disadvantaged groups. You know, we have many more of those people where I come from. You have a much more equitable society. I come from a society in which there are huge disparities in wealth and backgrounds of students. But I know you have a growing immigrant population, and that's part of your concern, or others perhaps. But this concept that you can outreach them to get them the sense, oh, I could go to university, I could go to Malmo, that's a very important component. Then there's the process of selection itself. And I don't know how much of the national norms that you have, you know, or regulations you have related to admissions. But to give you an example of the University of California, although it's struggling very much with having what we call parity, this concept of some kind of equitable representation of the demography of California for students who are coming in. They have a traditional kind of process for accepting students, but they also have what we call exceptions to the rules, ways to look at different kinds of backgrounds of students that hold promise that they would be a good student. One is, are they a really great artist, or they other kinds of things that show other kinds of value. Sports as well, we could argue about that, but there are aspects in which sports is also an important aspect of talent and knowledge and capacity. Another is that we have done, which is mimicked and has been done also, another thing not just mimicked but done before, and that's this conceptual idea of accepting the top 6% of any student who is in the top 6% of their particular school automatically could be accepted to a place like Berkeley, for example. And we've done studies on this, like, oh, do these students perform that well once they come? And they do. They perform very well, and they graduate almost at the same rate. So those are at least some aspects. I think that personal touch of institutions, outreach to communities is really important. Even just personal letters to potential students that come from your vice rector have tremendous influence on how students perceive whether you're an open place to go or not. Then once they're here, you have to support them. And that's the same thing with international students as well, which is an area in which a lot of universities have been negligent until recently, is that students that come from different cultures come to a place like Sweden or come to a place like Berkeley, and they need to have support structures around them to make sure that they can, housing is one obvious aspect, but have the ability to, do well at the institution. So those are all cost money and institutional effort to do it properly. And even then, the outcomes aren't necessarily what you would hope they would be.
Tapio, please.
I think we are wrapping up if we don't have any more questions.
Oh, I lost touch of time. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. I have to speak in the mic. Okay. So I just want to conclude with some short words. First, I want to thank our colleague from Lund University.
Travel all the way here.
All the way. 20 kilometers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Via Flagship, of course. I took the boat.
Okay,
I took the boat.
And I also want to express our gratitude to John, of course.
Thank you.
For your mind-provoking. You open up quite a lot of questions. I know that there's no easy answers, and you haven't given us those. But I think you have given us quite a lot of questions that we have to work with so far. So thank you, and we will keep you posted what's happening at
I suppose you have a ticket in 2020 for John to come back to
course.
tick all the boxes.
So I think we conclude with a warm applause to
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And keep posted on the website and so on. We are in the planning process for many very interesting seminars this coming year. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm still on the thing. Okay. Yeah. I hope I didn't